Hello, generations young, old, and everyone in between. Welcome to Generation Apollo, where we believe in you getting the best value for your dollar. And today on the latest episode of Generation Apollo Reacts, I take a look at a report that came out not too long ago detailing just how dire the financial straits are for the Millennial Generation, where despite being the overwhelming representation of the workforce, they control less than 5% of total U.S. wealth. Now, this came out back in October, not too long ago. They actually had it featured on CNN several weeks ago, and I've been meaning to get around to making a video of this, so now here I am. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at this article from Newsweek about how millennials control just 4.2% of U.S. wealth, and being 4 times poorer than the baby boomers were at the same age, roughly around age 34. So we're going to take a look at this article because I got a few comments on this, so let's get into this. The Millennial Generation, people born between 1981 and 1996, make up the largest share of the U.S. workforce, but control just 4.6% of the country's total wealth. Baby boomers, people born between 1946 and 1964, currently control 10 times more than the millennials, whose 72 million workers make them the most represented group in the workforce. Although it's not unusual for younger age groups to have less money than their elders, the average baby boomer working in 1989 during their early 30s had quadruple the wealth of what millennials have at the same age today. 3 millennials, Mark Zuckerberg and Dustin Moskovitz, who co-founded Facebook, and Walmart heir Lucas Walton hold $1 out of every $40 among their generation. Boomers control the majority of U.S. wealth, $59.6 trillion to be exact, which is twice the $28.5 trillion held by Gen X and more than 10 times the $5.2 trillion held by millennials. Millennials, who are at the median age of 32 today, control just 4.6% of U.S. wealth, far behind the 21% boomers had at about the same age about a generation ago. These working young adults will need to quadruple their bank accounts in the next 2 years in order to match the financial share controlled by their parents during the late 80s, when the median boomer was roughly about 34 years old. A generational wealth report published Thursday by Bloomberg News draws from Federal Reserve data and shows the richest 50 American individuals have as much money as half of the United States, or 165 million people. The glaring disparities highlighted in the report reveal the coronavirus pandemic has worsened the many of the already wide financial divides. The 50 richest people in the U.S. have earned $340 billion in just the first half of 2020, pushing the total worth of these several dozen people to nearly $2 trillion in combined wealth. One major factor for the wealth disparity is the overwhelming majority of Americans don't benefit from rising stock prices. Yes, that is one aspect, but there's also another aspect that they're not mentioning here, but I'll get to that in a second. The richest 1% of Americans own more than 50% of the equity in corporations and mutual fund shares, Bloomberg notes. Upper middle class Americans have seen a 10% drop in their equity interest in companies, as the richest 10% of U.S. adults now hold 88% of all U.S. stock shares. And we have a nice little visual representation here if you guys want to see it, which I have right here. So get a load of that, guys. Boomer wealth way up here. Gen X is still already pretty close to rock bottom, but even worse than them are millennials. That's you guys all the way down here. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, guys, but this is how it is. And Gen Z, if you're listening to this, I'm not hopeful that your situation is going to be any better than ours. So. Anyway, let's get back to the article at hand. The Federal Reserve estimates the top 10% of U.S. households control 70%, or about $77.3 trillion of the country's total wealth. This marks a 10% increase from the 1980s. And while the top 1% of Americans held on to 30.5% of U.S. wealth in June, the bottom 15% of the entire country went from having just 3.6% down to 1.9%. Millennials have been unable to catch up with Gen X members, adults who were born between 1965 and 79, who surpassed the wealth of older silent generation people who are currently aged 75 to 95 today in 2018. Americans in Gen X have doubled their collective net worth since mid-2016. Now, that's also not surprising because if you consider that Gen X was the first generation to go to college on a wide scale, but also be the first generation to have to endure rising tuition prices. So they had student loan debts they had to pay off. And then you also take into account all the various economic setbacks that they've had over the course of their lifetime so far. So starting with the recessions in the early 90s, the dot-com bubble popping in the around 2000. And then, of course, you had the 2007, 2008 collapse, and now the coronavirus pandemic, which is threatening pretty much everyone right now. So it's not surprising that it's only now that Gen X has finally doubled their collective net worth, considering that the average median age of Gen X is now roughly early to mid-40s, and the oldest of them are now pushing 50. Think about that, folks. They're only just now, as they're almost approaching, retirement age, or at least only a decade away from retirement age, and they finally doubled their net worth. Is that a sign of things to come for millennials or for other younger generations? Who knows? We'll see. All right, but let's get back to this. Big tech billionaires have led the charge to the top of the world's richest lists, including Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, whose fortune during the COVID-19 pandemic alone has grown 64% in 2020. Bezos is now worth $188.5 billion, making more than $5 billion on Wednesday alone. Jesus Christ, holy shit. How would you like to have that kind of pay raise? I know I sure as hell would. In addition to the vast generational wealth disparities in the federal report, large racial gaps persist across the U.S. as well. White Americans control 84% of the country's wealth, compared to 4.1% held by black Americans. Newsweek reached out to the Federal Reserve for any additional remarks on Thursday. All right, and the article just abruptly ends there. So, all right, let's go ahead and get on to my commentary. Okay, for those of you following along, did you notice how the article mentions the problem, i.e. millennials are poor? Yeah, no shit, they're poor. Why are they poor? That's the question. It almost seems to tiptoe around what we know is one of the main issues. Now, it did try to offer a potential explanation by saying that the majority of Americans don't benefit from rising stocks, which is true, they don't. But that's not nearly as much of a contributing factor for why millennials and young people overall are so poor. Do you know the real reason? On now, you should know this. Notice how the article made absolutely no mention whatsoever about the student debt crisis. Right? There's your reason right there why millennials control less than 5% of total U.S. wealth. This shouldn't come as any surprise, considering that millennials borrowed such obscene amounts of money to the point where they've spent at least a decade of their lives trying to repay those loans. I actually have a few friends who only just recently, as in the last few months, finished paying off their student loans. One of them was someone I actually mentioned in one of my last videos where she has a high-paying job and she just finally made her last student payment after 20 years. The other one I know is a guy who studied engineering and just finished paying off his student loans a few months ago. Both of them are in their 30s now, and they're just finally now managing to unchain themselves from the millstone of student debt. And yet they're the lucky ones because they were at least smart enough to get degrees in high demand fields so they could make good enough salaries to be able to actually repay their student loans and still be able to support themselves. And let's not forget that there's a whole lot of millennials out there who also borrow tens of thousands of dollars to study worthless bullshit subjects that have no employment potential whatsoever. And they're around the same age as my friends, but they're not even close to being able to pay off their student loans. And so that brings me to the question of what will this mean for America's future? Well, if we as a society are going to demand that young people have four-year degrees if they ever hope to make a living wage, and if we demand that they spend 30 to 50 grand to get them, then we're going to have to accept the fact that young people are going to take longer to achieve the basic milestones of adulthood than previous generations. If young people start off in debt, then they won't achieve financial stability until their mid to late 30s at least, whereas their parents were able to achieve that same milestone in their early to mid 20s. In other words, we're just going to have to accept this as the new normal. And if young people delay adulthood into their 30s, then that's going to mean fewer new businesses being formed, because the vast majority of people who try their luck at entrepreneurship, who are willing to take risks, are young people, not 65-year-old boomers. They aren't the ones starting new companies making innovative products. And if fewer new businesses are being formed, then that means fewer new jobs and increasing unemployment. Now, how do you think that's going to play out for America's economic future? And what about declining birth rates and new family formations? Ladies, this one's for you. And by the way, let me just say up front that I absolutely support women's freedom to choose whether they want to be mothers or pursue careers. I'm all for free will. But all I'm saying is that if our society is going to encourage or even demand that women go to college and pursue careers, then we have to understand that there will be trade-offs and there will be long-term consequences as a result. Let's look at what I'm talking about. Now, a woman's prime childbearing years start from around age 16 or 17 and continue up until around 27 to 29. So a woman's fertility window is a little over a decade. So if a young woman goes to college at 18 and graduates at 22, then she's already lost 4 years. And if she gets a job immediately after, considering the fact that she'll have to work for a minimum of 5 years before she'll even start to make anything close to a decent salary, and that's if she was smart enough to study a subject with good employment prospects. But if she studied some bullshit major with low employment potential, like, pink-haired SJW unicorn gender studies, for example, then, oh boy, she's in trouble. So by the time a young woman finishes college and gains enough job experience to start making a living wage, she's already exhausted nearly her entire fertility window. And by the way, guys, there's increasing evidence to suggest that men might also have their own biological clocks. Although men's fertility doesn't have a set-in-stone expiration date like women's does, studies over the past decade have shown that sperm quality degrades as a man ages. So if a guy decides to father a child later in life, as in over the age of 30, then he runs an increased risk that his offspring will have health problems, even if his partner is younger and still within her ideal fertility window. So that means if a woman waits too long and tries to have a kid outside of her ideal fertility years, she's running a higher risk of having a child with severe health problems. But if she has a child before she's able to earn a living wage, then both her and her kid could end up living in poverty and become dependent on at least one form of government assistance just to survive. And while this is virtually guaranteed to happen if she's a single mother, this can also happen even if she's lucky enough to find a stable partner. Because if she gets pregnant and can't work for a few years while raising her kid, and her 20-something-year-old partner becomes solely responsible for supporting the family, they won't be much better off because he hasn't reached his peak earning years either. Hell, there are plenty of guys in their 30s or 40s who aren't making a living wage. But my point is, because of human biology, there's a narrow window of ideal fertility for both women and men to have kids. But we've structured society in a way that forces young people to spend that limited window of opportunity just trying to get on their own feet, let alone support a family. And all thanks to stagnant wages and the fact that we brainwashed young people into taking on crushing debt right from the beginning, so they start out already with negative net worth. This is literally worse than starting out with nothing, and that is why millennials only control 5% of America's wealth compared to what their parents did at the same age. Do you all see the problem here? Are you starting to see why this is not sustainable and how it will have dire consequences for society in the long run? How much longer are we going to keep this going? And simply bailing them out isn't the answer. That's just a band-aid, and it doesn't address the core problem. Instead of asking how young people are going to pay higher and higher prices for college, maybe we ought to be asking ourselves, why does a college education cost so much in the first place? Maybe because the government insures all student loans so that there's no risk for creditors or the colleges themselves, thus allowing them to jack up tuition rates into the stratosphere? I say we go back to the way things were decades ago, where the only government money that colleges received was for certain kinds of research grants, and tuition wasn't federally guaranteed. If we do that, I promise you'll see tuition rates drop like someone wearing cement shoes, and then young people would actually be able to pay their way through school with a part-time summer job working in fast food, just like the boomers love to claim that they did. My point is, the only way we're going to solve this crisis is by ensuring that young people are able to achieve financial independence as early in life as possible. I hear so many older folks say that they started out with nothing and worked their way up until they were able to achieve financial security. The problem today is that young people are starting out with less than zero. They have to struggle for years just to get to zero. That's the problem. If millennials actually started at zero, they would be controlling a lot more than fucking 5% of the wealth. And I know because I started at zero and worked my way up, and it still took me well over a decade to get to where I am now. This is what so many stupid boomers and Gen Xers don't understand. If you older generations actually think the system is okay as it currently is, then the problem isn't with the young people or their supposed lack of work ethic. The problem is with you guys, because you older generations control the vast majority of the money. You own all the major assets, and you're the ones in positions of authority. Therefore, the power to change the system is in your hands, and the fact that you older generations who are supposed to have young people's best interests in mind have allowed this predatory system to remain in place tells me that you're probably benefiting from it in some way. Despite what the lamestream media says, most millennials and Gen Z are not ignorant of the fact that we have to start from the bottom and work towards success. Yes, there are some who are lazy and want handouts, but by and large, the majority of us actually want to be able to work and build wealth legitimately. The problem, as I said earlier, isn't starting from zero and working your way up. The problem is struggling for years to the point of burnout just to get to zero. So spare me the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps diatribe, because I don't want to hear it. And if we don't address this problem soon, eventually we're going to get to the point where no one under the age of 65 will control any portion of America's wealth. And with that, I'll conclude my rant here. So, what do you all think? Is there any way for the millennials to recover from this? Will we ever wake up in time to prevent a major financial catastrophe for the younger populations? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and share to help this channel grow. And lastly, please be sure to follow me on alt tech platforms. The links to all my page, as well as the article I mentioned, will be in the description. So thanks again for watching, and thank you for tuning in to Generation Apollo.